The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, your AML automation software for faster onboarding, smarter monitoring, and growth without overhead. What are some of the best techniques that you have picked up when it comes to making sure internal audits goes as smoothly as possible? What's the top 3 tips here?
Well, it's probably communication. So it's all about the communication.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance, and financial crime to the real world. Internal auditors may be the ultimate insider-outsider in the world of financial services. Independent from the other lines of defense, but required to know the inner workings of all their processes. Hired to flag issues and right wrongs, but sometimes pressured by management not to flag too many issues. They are on average 1% of a bank's staff, and yet they are there to keep the other 99% in check. Oh, and they're also balancing new regulations and the ongoing threats that we all face in rooting out shady operators and financial crime. So, no pressure then. I'm your host, Marit, CEO at Strise, and in this episode, we are asking what keeps internal auditors up at night. We'll be discussing how the audit process looks from the inside, the hardest part of the role, and the solutions to ease those sleepless nights. And to dive into this topic, I'm here with Eleanor Streatfield, Head of Internal Audit for FinCrime at Wise. Eleanor is an experienced risk and people manager. Before recently moving into the world of fintech, she spent nearly 2 decades in senior roles related to risk and audits at big banks in both the UK and Australia. Welcome to The Laundry, Eleanor. It's great having you here.
Thank you so much, Marit. It's really lovely to be here.
We met at a Women's Day event organized by Plenitude and Strise, and that's when I thought, I need to make an episode about internal audits on The Laundry. So I'm glad that we could finally make that work.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
But what got you interested in compliance in the first place?
So for me, compliance is really interesting because it allows you to ask lots of questions and find out lots of, information about how organizations work. So I've always been someone who loves a question. I can never quite decide what subjects to focus on as I went through my education. And I ended up in internal audit at the first bank that I worked at when I was in a graduate role. And I think through that, I got great exposure to lots of different businesses and understanding how things connect together within the bank. So that's naturally led on to a career in financial crime.
I like that, the question bit. It's about curiosity as well. It's all about, digging deeper. I like that. But thanks for the intro. Let's get into the discussion. So let's start by looking at the audit process and the big challenges. So could you just sum up the defining aims of an internal auditor in one sentence, if we start there?
So for me, internal audit is about providing assurance on the governance, risk management, and internal controls that an organization has. And ultimately, it's to be able to enable that organization to achieve its goals, but make sure it's being done in a compliant and safe way that protects the employees, the shareholders, and ultimately our customers.
So I don't know that much about internal audit. So I'm actually really curious to kind of get all the information about how the internal audit process looks like. So I'm sure it's a lot of steps, but can't you just start at the beginning? What does it look like?
We will go through a planning process on an annual basis where we'll identify which audits we have to do because there's a regulatory requirement. Otherwise,
do they all happen at the same time each year? Is it January each year you start the planning, or does it happen on different times throughout the year? Or
so you will have an annual cycle where you'll do a full assessment of the plan, but then that will be reviewed on a quarterly basis to make sure it still makes sense. So when we do that annual planning process, we'll take into consideration the different elements of an organization and then consider what are the different factors, both from a quant basis and a qual basis, as to why we want to be able to include them within the audit plan. So there will be a very long list of areas that we might want to audit, and it's about that prioritization at the start of the year to be able to identify what has to get done in the next 12 months.
Oh, how do you do that prioritization? What's on the top of the list for you in 2025? What was the big ones?
So obviously I can't go into the specifics of our audit plan, but there's a lot of regulatory interest when it comes to how controls work in the AML space. So it's understanding where we are in the cycle in terms of meeting those regulatory expectations, in terms of delivering those audits. And then there's also, which we'll get on to, work on, doing testing on issues that have been closed in the past and making sure that they have been fixed appropriately. So we'll do an annual planning process and say we have, a particular area that we want to audit. So then we will do the engagement with the relevant stakeholders in first line and second line to be able to understand what the nature of that particular topic area is at the planning stage.
Are they happy to see you, or do they kind of like, oh God, no, here comes internal audit and now we're worried?
It depends on the nature of the organization, but the organizations I've worked at, there's been a very good dynamic. And I think it's about building those relationships with your stakeholders, understanding what their challenges are. And during that planning process, there will be conversations around, what are you currently working on? What are the material projects? What's the availability of the core teams? And I think if you can have some of that awareness upfront when you're doing your planning, it just helps in terms of the sequencing and the flow of the audit. So during that planning phase, you will identify key regulation, identify how the risks have been categorized within the organization and the controls that they've designed to be able to mitigate those risks. And then we'll go on to the fieldwork section, where we'll design the tests to be able to test the design of controls, test the operating effectiveness of controls. And then at the end of that, if we have any exceptions, it's the conversations with the relevant control owners to validate those exceptions.
You talked there about, building the relationship with the key stakeholders. Is it so that like throughout the year, you make sure you have coffee by the coffee machine and you kind of build that relationship in that very human way beforehand to make sure it all works out? So
I think it's about identifying who your key stakeholders are across the organization. I mean, the role that I have currently is very broad, and that's great. It's lots of opportunity, but it's just making sure that, okay, I understand who are the relevant teams which are going to be regularly contacted from an internal audit perspective and keeping the dialogue going with those specific teams. And then working proactively to be able to sense check if things are on track or if they're delayed, if you have any audit issues, and what we can do to be able to support in terms of if plans have had to change. But if we go back to the actual audit process, so we got to the point where we might have some findings that we want to be able to identify if there's any other mitigating factors or any additional context. And when you have those discussions towards the end of an audit, it allows you to just validate that we've got the right information and there hasn't been any misunderstanding. And what is really helpful is when you can do the data analytics to be able to understand the impact of a exception that you've identified through sample testing. So when you do your testing, you'll design the sort of test steps, and that might identify a single anomaly. And then by using data analytics, you can then extrapolate that out and see if there are other scenarios in the wider population that could also be impacted by that exception. So that leads to some really good conversations with management, because if you have like one of a sample of 15, for example, is an error rate, but then actually you can demonstrate to them like why it's important by understanding the impact, that's a helpful conversation to have.
And just hypothetically, because I know you can't kind of go into specifics, but let's say what would be such an exception that you found, like just to kind of make it more tangible to the listeners?
So if there was like a regulatory expectation that you did a certain type of verification on a certain type of customer, then if you found anomalies where you could see that some customers had not gone through that routing journey, like the verification step hadn't happened for some reason, they would be ones you would pick out, and then you'd have conversations to be able to understand if there's a reason why. So it would be going back to what is required from a regulatory and then a policy perspective for the organization. So the policies that you have might be above and beyond the basic regulatory. They might be also taking into consideration what the risk appetite of the organization is. So we would be looking both from an alignment between the regulations to the policy and then the policy to the process, and seeing how that all flows.
In general, this process, what is it that keeps you up at night throughout this process? Like when you go to sleep, you're like, oh, I'm thinking about this. Like, what is that thing?
I think when you get towards the end of an audit, you're tying those knots together around, okay, the linkages between the different parts. So what my brain starts to process and, can keep you up at night is how does everything join together? Especially when you're working in rather large and complicated organizations. And there can be controls that operated in slightly different ways or need to be tailored to be able to meet the local market requirements. So my understanding of how the requirements fit together is the bit that is definitely a journey for me in terms of understanding those component parts and figuring out what's important and why are the things that definitely keep my brain whirring. So I don't really have sleepless nights because I'm worried about, specific things that are going on, but it's just more that connectivity of the information to make sure that I've got the right understanding of anything that we're working through. Because as you get to the end of the audit, when you've got those findings, you'll then gather them together to actually form formal audit issues, which will go out in the report. And that's when you're having the really sort of senior stakeholder conversations to make sure they understand why you're rating issues a certain way and about having that engagement. So sometimes, again, you're playing through the conversations that you're about to have and making sure that you can prepare for the challenge that they might have onto why you've raised things in a certain way. That can be quite good.
Obviously, now you work at Wise. It's like a huge fintech. I mean, it's so big at this. It's like it's not a newly started one. It's really big. But you've also worked in banks, and I was wondering, have you observed like a big difference in the internal audit process between more the traditional banking sector and the more fintech sector such as Wise?
From a big bank perspective, obviously they've been around a long time. There's lots of sort of hierarchy and committees and structure and process that's already very well established and is being iterated. They also have lots of legacy systems, which have maybe, evolved gently over time. Whereas I think the dynamic within the fintech space is the pace of change is much faster. So actually, from an audit perspective, it's keeping track of how things are changing. So if we did an audit with a relevant period, which was in 2024, you're then agreeing any remedial actions at the end of that audit with a view to what was relevant during that period. But then the processes might continue to iterate as they're planning and improving within 2025. So it's trying to understand that what was the agreed action plan to be able to remediate anything that was found, how that then aligns to any upcoming changes. So being able to work out which communication channels you need to be connected to keep pace with that change, I think is a big difference between the banks and the fintech that I currently work at. So yeah, the other way is the communication. So communication at the banks is very sort of formal, emails, sit down meetings, schedules, etc., committees, whereas there's a lot more dynamic communication using Slack. And as you mentioned, like just catching people in the office and having quick conversations to connect different threads. So the adapting of the styles, but the key message is that you've got to be able to build those relationships within whichever structure you're working.
We are going to talk more about the relationships later, but I just wanted to ask about, you said, pace of change, all these things, like how much is the internal tech system, like the system that you use is like a help or a hindering in terms of internal audit? Because I can't imagine, let's say you do your internal audit, you see that, oh, we have a huge flaw in some of the controls that we see a lot of discrepancies in our findings. Okay, let's fix it. And then the fix can be really hard because of the way systems are built. Like, what's your take on this? Like, what's your experience here?
It's about understanding who are the right people to talk to. So yes, you might have identified the finding through the operational agent testing that you've done, like in terms of what they've done. But then sometimes it can be, as you unravel it and work through the root cause, it could be to a tech configuration element. So it's working with the relevant teams sort of in the product space to make sure that they understand the downstream impacts and that we are really clear on what needs to be fixed and why. So it's about joining people together. So you might find something that with a team that wasn't necessarily in the scope of the audit initially in some ways. So sometimes you can follow a thread where you actually identify something that leads you to additional conversations. So it's just explaining the importance of the controls and why we need them there.
Is there sometimes you feel the technology is also like a hinder to designing effective controls, or is it like you still see it as a solid helper in that regard? I mean, it's probably both, but just would love to hear your thoughts on this, on what you've seen throughout your career.
Yeah, I think obviously if you're putting in controls like segregation of duties between different processes and that you need two people involved, then you can use the technology to do that. But then as an auditor, I would inquire, okay, how can that be, circumvented? What is the testing steps that I can design to be able to actually see whether the technology is working to achieve the aim that they wanted? So, you'd see if there is actually people who have two user profiles that have, different configurations across those two. They shouldn't be able to, but just because they shouldn't doesn't mean you shouldn't test for it. So it's about understanding how it's meant to work and then, testing to see whether there is a way around it or a difference. So I think technology can definitely help with controls, but then it needs to have the right level of monitoring as to the effectiveness of that control. So if you've designed a system flow so that you always push customers through a certain verification path that we were talking about, then what is your follow-up as a control owner to make sure that you've not got any exceptions or anomalies? Like, where's the monitoring of that control?
On the podcast previously, we've covered like sanctions fatigue, MLRO burnout, so I'm just wondering, is audit fatigue something that's talked about in your line of work? Is that a real thing, or is it, what's your take?
So I think it goes back to when we have the conversations about the annual plan. There are certain teams that are going to be regularly audited. So it's about understanding how you can schedule the audits in an appropriate way, or where possible, do combined walkthroughs. So if you've got control teams who do standardized controls across different geographies, how can we leverage the walkthrough process to be able to understand how those processes work in a sort of an aggregated perspective? But it's balancing that, as we went back to at the start, the regulatory requirement to be able to perform these audits with the operational impact within the first line teams. In the second line sort of compliance teams, and then any sort of 1.5 teams as well, that it's understanding what the work stack is like. So it might be that you have a decision that if suddenly a regulatory inspection happens in a certain jurisdiction, that then you would have to have a conversation if there was an in-flight audit as to how the key stakeholders who would need to be able to support both reviews can allocate their time. So there can be situations where you might pause an audit and then pick it back up again at an appropriate time. But then other times you've just got to work with the compliance to figure out how can they support both. So it'll depend on the rationale as to why you need to do the audit in the first place.
Our overall goal at Strise: eradicate financial crime. To achieve this, we know we have to build a network of expert partners to put together the ultimate package for compliance and AML teams globally. Let's hear what Plenitude, the leading independent consultancy in financial crime compliance, and one of our partners has to say.
The single biggest issue that are facing our clients in regulated firms at the moment is the increasing cost of compliance. Some of the pain points that clients are trying to address is that requirement to automate both AML and KYC controls. We've been working with Strise initially on a proof of concept exercise to test their solutions in the UK marketplace. But now we've formalised that partnership, and we're now in a position to obviously offer to our clients Strise solutions alongside advisory and implementation support as part of deployment of those solutions. One of the things that we really like about Strise and their solutions is it does enable our clients to realise the benefits of AI relatively quickly, and the implementation timelines are relatively short compared to other solutions.
Want to work together? Visit strise.ai and click Become a Partner to book a meeting. You've worked in this for a while, and what are some of the best techniques that you have picked up when it comes to making sure internal audits goes as smoothly as possible? What's the top 3 tips here?
Well, it's probably communication. So it's all about the communication. So if you have done some inquiry yourself to be able to do some research on your intranets, wikis, whatever you call it, that we think these are your processes, make sure they are the current ones and that the wikis are up to date before you start going and doing the testing. So whilst you can do some of your research yourself, you really need to confirm that that's the right process that you're designing your test script, so you just don't waste time to be able to do that. Then when it comes to the findings, it's consideration of who else needs to be looped into this conversation, like you said before. So whilst you might be having a conversation with one team that operates a control, have we actually had the right conversations around the organization to make sure that we have a full understanding of what this potential finding is? So yeah, definitely communication.
And what's your communication style between internal auditors and the teams in these situations? Does it get heated? Is it formal? Like, what's the communication style?
So as you progress the audit, I think regular communication is really important. So we will form a Slack channel at Wise, and that's used for the regular updates on the status, because I think that really helps the teams understand what testing is completed, what's still in progress, and then using mechanisms to be able to formally document with the evidence to support it why you've got a finding that they can, come back on. They will need some meetings, but it's actually having that audit trail of this is what we found, this is your response. So using a combination of both discussion-based communication and then also evidencing it so that we can note that we have got the alignment and the agreement on the findings. And there will be times when an audit issue has a debate around what risk classification it will have in terms of issue rating. And then it's about justifying why we think it needs to be a certain rating and then listening to the other side in terms of why they think it shouldn't be. And as necessary, those conversations can be elevated up the organization. But ultimately, internal audit is independent. So we will elevate those conversations as we need to. But generally, we can, with the right engagement, have a good discussion if there are any contentious ones. And I think you have to be prepared for that. Like, we wouldn't be doing our job properly if we don't have the evidence to be able to back up why we think something should be a certain rating.
Yeah, for sure. What's the feedback from the teams in terms of the internal audit versus getting the external audit from the regulators? What's their take on that?
I don't know whether I've directly asked them. I think the collaboration can be a bit more with the internal audit team because it can be very, I wouldn't say necessarily always quite binary, but it'll be, okay, we want this information, give it to us from a regulatory perspective, and you provide the information pack. They go away and review it, and there might be certain opportunities by which you can then comment and confirm on anything that they find. Whereas I think with an internal audit, it's generally a bit more on an ongoing discussion basis. So that allows you to be able to hopefully help the business identify things that they weren't aware of themselves before a regulator comes in and does a review.
How do you keep on top of new regulations? Like, what's your personal kind of workflow for that?
So, I mean, I love a bit of LinkedIn in terms of things that are coming through. I think just generally keeping informed in terms of those different channels, whilst having a general understanding of regulation that's coming in. I think it's making sure that at the time that you're doing a specific review in a specific jurisdiction, you then really do your research around what's required at that, for the period under review. And it might be when you're doing that audit planning process that you'll be thinking ahead around, okay, incoming regulation or, expected implementation dates, and to what extent you need to do any review before the implementation date or afterwards, after an embedding period, to make sure that we can demonstrate that we've got the right understanding that regulation is being complied with.
We are nearing the end, but we have talked about communication, and people and relationships. And we need to kind of finish a bit on this topic because we do live in a world where AI hype is real. Like, AI holds so much promise, and a lot of audit is text-based, which is, of course, a good area to apply LLMs and AI. But again, it's about communication, internal audits. And the one thing AI cannot do is walk around, talk to people face to face, at least not yet. It's building those relationships. So how do you see how AI will impact internal audit going forward? Will it change the internal audit process somehow?
I definitely think it will. There is areas where it can help support the research around relevant, regulations or inquiry on written text, as you say. So, summarizing and documents to be able to allow us to be able to find certain things. Again, that goes to making sure we have very clear prompting in terms of how we are asking AI tools to be able to support with that work, but with the relevant sense checks to make sure that the output is actually fit for purpose. So there will be certain tasks that it can support with. In terms of the ability to delegate tasks to AI into an agent, where we have sort of data analytics tests, I think that will be the area where it's what can you do to expand it further to be able to see, okay, if rather than it being a sort of a very binary, logical, code-based inquiry, if there's more that can be done around that. So I'm quite excited to see how it improves and continues. But again, you need to make sure that whatever you're writing is still valid for the architecture that you're providing the assurance over. Because if you keep tools running in the background, but then what they're assessing is changing, then you can have the misalignment between how you've designed your AI agents, testing that it's going to be doing to what is the current position. So, yeah, I think we can't ignore it. We need to make sure we're using it in the right way, but it needs to be done in a considered way.
Yeah. You can think that you get into this infinite mirror thing. Oh, now we need a fourth line of defense to, audit the AI. And then it's like, oh, and then we need another one to audit the AI that audits the AI. So it's very easy to kind of since internal audit, its purpose is to really check if you're compliant, how far can you take the automation, or is it like a human at the end who really needs to kind of dig into it? But anyways, that's at least some thoughts I have. But the building of the relationships between those people who will do a lot of oversee some of these processes, I think that is it's one key takeaway that I take with me, that it's super valuable and cannot be delegated to AI.
Yeah, and I think obviously some of the tools that we will be providing assurance over can have AI elements as well. So then it's about just taking it back to the basics to be able to say, okay, well, how does this work? Can you explain it? What's the logic? Making sure that it's testable, because if it's just too black box in terms of how things are deriving results, then that doesn't allow us to be able to provide the assurance over it. So it needs to have the right level of documentation if you have any of that technology being used.
Before we end this episode, we're going to dish out some quick fire questions for you. So I'll say a sentence and you just say the first thing that comes to mind. Shorter, the better. Are you ready?
Okay.
What's the best piece of advice you've received in your own compliance career?
How much by when?
Finish the sentence. The fastest way to fail an internal audit is
to lie or not have the evidence.
What's your advice for anyone listening who may be facing an internal audit soon?
Talk to the auditors, understand the process if it's new to you. They'll be very happy to explain.
Stepping back from company fines and reputations, why do audits matter in the real world?
I'm really fortunate to work in a role where we have direct impact in terms of helping to inform the controls that will keep society safe. So I think internal audit in financial crime has got a really valuable place.
I agree. That brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Eleanor, thank you so much for joining the show and sharing your knowledge. Where can people find and connect with you?
Oh, just on LinkedIn, great. Send me a little message and then I'll say hi back.
Money makes a world go round.
To everyone who was listening, thank you for tuning in to this episode. If you like this episode, please check out the back catalog of the laundry. We have more than 120 episodes now, I believe. So there is something for everyone there. Your host for this episode was me, Marit. Our producer was Matthew. Our editor was Dominic. Our engineer was Nicholas. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise. We build AML automation software. Visit strise.ai for more information. See you next time.
Your money make a world go round.
Okay, this is my bonus question. What is the one thing you found in an internal audit that really kept you up at night?
Ooh, I can't really answer that specifically. That's really cheeky, Marit. You tried to sneak it in there at the end.
All right. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, your AML automation software for faster onboarding, smarter monitoring, and growth without overhead.